Today, I want to tell a story about a violent storm in Willow Creek and a door that opened onto fate. The night the storm broke over Willow Creek, Clara Boone understood without knowing how that nothing afterward would ever sit the same again. Not the way one knows a date or recalls a road traveled 100 times. She sensed it as a vibration beneath her ribs, the way the air sharpens just before lightning tears the sky open. Wind slammed against her small cabin as if a massive hand had pressed flat against the walls, testing the timbers, challenging their resolve. The cottonwoods bowed hard, shedding leaves in frightened bursts. The creek, usually a murmuring line of calm, swelled, lifted its voice and learned how to roar. Clara had lived alone long enough to read weather like scripture. After her husband's death, life had narrowed itself to what mattered. Firewood stacked straight, dough left to rise, oil measured carefully, freshly mended hems laid across a chair, a Bible worn soft by years of turning pages. Solitude had not hardened her. It had sharpened her. She read the sky the way other women read faces. Tonight it offered no comfort, only warning. Thunder crossed the valley with heavy steps, slow and certain. The horizon flashed as though some unseen hand were yanking a curtain of light open and slamming it shut again. She added another log to the fire and listened as the cabin answered back, a groan here, a rattle there, the way an old companion might complain, but endure all the same. Her hands browned by sun and labor moved with practiced economy. She checked the door latch, pulled the blue quilt snug across the bed, and placed the kettle close to the embers. Order calmed her, though beneath it ran a thin pull of loneliness. Willow Creek never gave freely. Out here you asked little of the world and everything of yourself. Clara had learned both lessons well. Rain arrived not as a sheet, but as 1,000 sharp needles. It struck the window panes and turned the path to the woodpile into slick mud. Wind climbed the chimney and howled like something furious and trapped. For a while the storm felt like company, loud, relentless, impossible to ignore. But as the night stretched on, the storm grew heavier in a different way. It pushed into her thoughts, and with it came the old ache, the memory of laughter buried in the ground, a hand she would never hold again. Standing by the window shawl tight around her shoulders, she watched lightning split the sky. For one blinding instant the valley turned silver. She saw the slope down to the creek, the fence line, the dark backs of marching clouds and movement just at the edge of sight. When darkness returned, the cabin felt smaller, as if the night had closed around it. The second flash confirmed what the first had only suggested. A figure in the rain. Tall, bareheaded. Steam rising where lightning briefly warmed the water streaming off him. Clara's breath caught. Even the storm seemed to pause, listening with her. A rider, perhaps, or trouble. The knock came softly at first, nearly swallowed by rain. 3 taps, close together, then the pause a person takes when deciding what story to tell. Clara didn't move. The fire snapped. The kettle sang its thin, steady note. Her heart answered the door before her body did, pounding hard against her ribs. Another knock followed, stronger now. Not a plea, but a declaration of presence. She lifted the kettle aside, wiped her hands on her apron, crossed the room. With each step, the life she knew slipped further away. At the door, she pressed her palm against the wood. It thrummed with the storm's force and with the nearness beyond it. She lifted the latch. Rain surged inside first. Cold, merciless. Then a man filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and slick with rain. Long dark hair hung heavy like soaked raven feathers. His eyes met hers as if he already knew them. Not blue, not green, but the deep shade of water where the creek runs slow beneath willow shadow. He stood still, like a mountain allowing weather to break against it. Firelight traced the hard lines of his face, the strength of his jaw, the sharp curve of his cheekbone, a calm that did not belong to a night like this. "I need shelter," he said, voice low. Steady in a way the storm was not. The words carried authority but also restraint, as though he were asking permission to step inside a church. Clara Boone had always believed herself to be a practical woman, built more on backbone than on softness. And yet something ancient stirred inside her now, something as old as the land itself, something that recognized strength and restraint, sharing the same body. She stepped back without trusting her voice, and the man crossed the threshold. The door shut out the rain. What followed was not silence, but a living charge, the kind that raises the fine hairs along your arms. He stayed close to the doorway, careful not to leave more water on her floor than the storm had already forced beneath it. The smell of wet earth and wood smoke clung to him, sharpened by the clean bite of rain. He spoke his name quietly. Rook. And in that name lived the sound of wind threading through tall grass, the whisper of a hawk's feather, cutting air. Stone Ridge Apache. Clara understood, not as a label, but as a history standing behind him, older than the town, older than the fence posts men drove into soil to convince themselves the land could be owned. For a long moment they studied one another with the blunt honesty of people who had no use for pretense. Outside, the storm battered the cabin's walls. Inside, firelight shaped small islands of warmth around them. Clara gestured toward the hearth. "You can warm yourself there," she said, her voice steady enough. He inclined his head. Gratitude contained dignity, intact, and moved with a quiet grace that respected her space. The fire seemed to welcome him. Light traced the planes of his face. Shadow followed, settling into the places where mystery lived. He asked no questions. He did not crowd the room with talk. Clara, long accustomed to the noise of passing men, their boasts, bargains, and small lies, found the quiet felt like mercy. She set the kettle back over the coals. The water began its soft song again. Between them, something unnamed drew its first breath. Wind struck the cabin once more. Rain slapped the windows hard. The night beat like a drum, and the storm knew the rhythm. Clara poured 2 tin cups of tea and handed one to him. Their fingers did not meet. Still warmth rose in her chest, as if the space between their hands carried its own ember. He took the cup, nodded once, and watched the fire the way she often did, as though it were a book that revealed itself only to those patient enough to look. "Bad road," he said, after a while. Simple words, enough meaning. "Bad night." "Yes," she answered, and inside that single word lived the creak of old boards, the ache of an empty chair, the long miles of wind separating one heart from another. She wondered where he had come from. What force had driven him into a storm fierce enough to strip bark from trees? She did not ask. Questions opened doors that could not be closed, and some doors once opened reshape a life forever. The cabin settled into itself. Heat bloomed from the hearth, softening the room's edges. The storm still raged, as if to prove it could. Then in moments it eased, like a child crying itself into sleep. Clara sipped her tea and felt her hands steady. Across from her, the Apache warrior sat upright, watchful without strain, a man capable of rest while remaining ready. In that fire-lit space, with the storm testing the world and finding it unyielding, Clara felt the smallest hinge turn within her. The quiet shift between before and after. She did not call it hope. She did not even call it change. But she knew, just as she knew weather, that a new front had moved in. Something real. Something undeniable, pressing against the shape of her days. She set her empty cup aside and listened to the rain. Somewhere in its 1,000 voices, she heard a promise she could not yet name. Still, she knew when the storm finally passed, Willow Creek would never sound the same. And neither would the life she had so carefully kept in order, because a stranger had knocked and she had opened the door. The storm pounded the valley as though it meant to tear the land in half. Yet inside Clara Boone's cabin, The howl of wind and the crash of thunder slowly lost their hold, not because the storm had weakened, but because something stronger had taken its place. The true tempest was no longer overhead. It lived inside the room, inside her chest, inside the stretched, breathless silence between her and the Apache warrior called Rook. Firelight grew restless, crawling along the walls, throwing shapes that flared and vanished. Clara sat near the hearth, a cup resting in her hands, pretending to drink, though the tea had gone cold. Across from her, he sat unmoving, carved from stone. His dark eyes followed the flames, yet never drifted far from her. Each time she lifted her gaze, she found him already watching. And whenever she looked away, her heart refused to settle. She had known solitude, but this was something else. This was not the pain of what had been lost. This was the ache of something living, breathing, close enough to touch. The air between them felt charged heavy with questions that had no language yet. Clara's hands shook as she set the cup aside. The fire snapped, sparks racing up the chimney, and she flinched as if they had struck her skin. His eyes tightened, not with anger but recognition, as if he felt the tension hidden in every sound, every movement. For a long moment, neither spoke. Silence felt safer than words. Words might name what was not meant to be named. Yet the silence carried its own pull, drawing them nearer than speech ever could. Clara leaned forward, intending only to place another log on the fire. Her hand brushed his as he reached for the same purpose. The touch was brief, unplanned, but it rolled through her like thunder echoing down a canyon. She froze, every nerve awake. He did not withdraw. Instead, his fingers remained for a single heartbeat longer than needed, the warmth of his skin burning into hers. When she finally pulled back, her pulse no longer belonged to her. It answered something older, something that claimed her. She tried to slow her breathing, but the storm beneath her ribs would not be stilled. Rook's voice came low, rough at the edge, yet free of threat. "Fire," he said, his gaze steady on hers. One word, yet it carried warmth. "Danger. Hunger." "Yes," Clara whispered. Her voice cracked like dry timber, but her meaning held. Outside, the storm battered the cabin shutters, rattling walls, trembling. Inside, the world narrowed to firelight and the space between two bodies, straining to close the distance. His eyes dropped to her hand, then rose again to meet her gaze. Slowly, with intent, he set aside his bow, his quiver, the weight of his weapons. As if to show her he carried no shield between them now, Clara caught her breath. She had seen men remove hats, boots, coats, but never with such reverence, never with such silent gravity. Each motion spoke without words. "I am not here as a warrior. I am here as a man." She stood to pour out the untouched tea, but her knees weakened. She steadied herself against the table. Before she could retreat into the safety of movement, his hand covered hers, firm, unyielding, yet gentle. She turned, finding his face only inches away. Firelight carved his cheekbones, glinting in the wet strands of his hair. For a heartbeat, the entire night balanced on a blade's edge. One breath too close. One step closer and it would happen. One step back and it would disappear. Clara Boone had always chosen caution. Survival had taught her when to restrain herself, when silence was the wiser path. But tonight, the storm beyond the walls had taught her another truth. The world never asked permission before changing a life. Sometimes it struck without warning, sudden as lightning, impossible to stop. Her hand lifted almost against her own command and came to rest on his shoulder. The heat beneath her palm startled her. The rain had left him cold to the bone, yet the man himself carried fire. At her touch, his eyes closed, a moment of surrender. Then he opened them again, and the look he gave her held both restraint and wanting. Their mouths met before either found a word. It was not gentle at first. It was need sharp, overwhelming, like a flood bursting through a weakened dam. Clara gasped against him, and he steadied her, one hand firm at her back, the other guiding her chin upward. She had never known she could want like this, not after years of grief, not after burying desire beneath duty and labor. Yet it surged through her, now wild and undeniable. The fire cracked louder as if answering the heat between them. Rain thundered against the roof, but Clara no longer heard it. The storm outside faded into a distant shadow. What passed between them was more than passion, it was recognition. Two souls who understood loneliness, who knew silence, who longed for more than mere survival. Every touch revealed something new. Every breath became surrender. Time slipped loose from its rules. Minutes or hours, it no longer mattered. The night turned into a circle, unbroken until the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon. Clara woke to embers where the fire had been. The space beside her lay empty. The blanket twisted around her legs felt colder without another body's warmth. She reached out, half believing she would find him there. But her hand met only rough wood and stillness. Rook was gone. The storm had gone with him, leaving the land rinsed in silver and gold. Willow Creek shimmered beneath the morning light, pure, as if the night had never existed. But Clara knew better. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands covering her face, heart pounding with longing, tangled with loss. She had no words for what had passed between them. No name for the fire that had claimed her. Only the certainty that her life had shifted. Something had moved. Something had taken hold. Clara stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight as cool air carried the scent of damp earth and pine. Mist lifted from the valley like smoke from a hidden flame. She closed her eyes, and for one fleeting moment she swore she could still feel his touch, still hear the rough edge of his voice. But when she opened them, there was only the empty ridge, the quiet cabin, and the ache of a night that refused to fade. The storm had crossed the mountains. Yet the fire it awakened in Clara Boone would burn long after the clouds were gone. The days that followed blurred together, but Clara felt each one keenly, as though the world had shifted its balance and now leaned differently upon her. The cabin remained unchanged. The valley lay quiet as ever. But nothing inside her was the same. A fire lived within her now, and though the Apache warrior had vanished with dawn, his presence lingered in ways she could neither silence nor explain. At first it surfaced in memory, a glance at the hearth, and she could almost see him there, sitting in stillness, shadows tracing the hard lines of his face. When she carried water from the creek, she imagined the fading rhythm of hooves. She told herself it was only imagination, the restless work of a lonely heart. Yet deep within she knew it was more than longing. Something had taken root inside her, a truth she was not yet brave enough to name. Weeks slid by, and routine slowly reclaimed her days. She mended clothes for neighbors, repaired hems and waistbands, carried loaves of bread to the miller's house when his wife fell ill. She smiled when spoken to, nodded politely when men tipped their hats. And she accepted the company of her old friend Miles Turner with quiet gratitude, though never with affection. On the surface, her life appeared steady, almost ordinary. But beneath that calm, Clara carried a secret. At first it spoke only through her body. Small warnings she might have dismissed if she chose. A sudden wave of sickness at dawn. A weariness that sank into her bones and refused rest. Her pulse quickening whenever her hand rested at her middle. Then came the signs she could not ignore. The gentle rounding of her belly. Changes she could no longer hide even from herself. Clara Boone was with child. The knowledge did not strike like thunder. It arrived like sunrise slow spreading, filling her with equal measures of fear and awe. She remembered his eyes, their intensity, the way Rook had touched her as if he were both claiming and yielding at once. That night had taken hold inside her, life growing where silence had once lived. Fear came first. Willow Creek was small, and small places thrived on whispers. A widow carrying a child without explanation would invite questions sharper than any storm wind. Who was the father? What shame had she welcomed? What sin hid behind her composed face? She could already hear the judgments of the Willow Creek locals, the careful distance at church, the smiles that tightened before turning away. Secrets carried weight. This one threatened to break her if revealed too soon. Yet fear did not stand alone. Pride rose alongside it. Pride that her body carried more than loneliness, it carried hope. Pride that something beautiful had been born from one night of fire and rain. Pride that though the man was gone, his memory lived on in the life stirring within her. At night, when the valley lay still and only the creek spoke, Clara sat by the window and let her thoughts drift. Would the child have his dark eyes unflinching, alive with untamed fire? Would the child laugh with that deep rumbling sound she still remembered? Would their hair fall straight and black or curl like her own? She pressed her hands to her belly and whispered, "You are not alone. You never will be." The months passed, and the weight of her secret grew heavier. Miles Turner noticed the changes first. His concern was quiet, unspoken, shown through small kindnesses: firewood left on her porch, fresh milk set by her door. He asked nothing. Perhaps he feared the truth, or perhaps he honored her silence. Either way, his presence remained steady, but it could not fill the hollow she carried. Clara's heart belonged to a man who had vanished into the storm. No amount of neighborly care could change that. The town kept its distance. Some saw only resilience in her, Clara Boone, the widow who endured, who helped with children, who asked little and gave much. Others watched with narrowed eyes, noting the changes in her shape, trading guesses behind closed doors. She bore it all with the quiet strength of someone who had survived worse. Winter arrived early that year. Snow blanketed the valley in silence. Clara wrapped herself in wool and pressed on, though each step felt heavier than the last. In those long, still nights, her thoughts returned to the warrior. Where was he now? Did he feel what she felt, a bond unseen, yet unbreakable? Did he dream of her, as she dreamed of him? Or had he forgotten as easily as the storm had passed the mountains? What Clara did not know was that far beyond the ridges and plains, the Apache warrior carried the same restlessness, a longing he could not yet name. Yet in his chest lived a pull that would not be stilled. In the curl of campfire smoke, in the hush of long hunts, in the still space between battles, he saw her face. He heard her voice. He felt the memory of her hand warm against his shoulder. He tried to bury it beneath duty, but duty could not smother what they had forged together. He had left her cabin at dawn, believing disappearance was mercy. But as the seasons shifted, the choice worked at him like a slow wound. Back in Willow Creek, Clara Boone met each day with quiet resolve. She stitched clothing for neighbors, children, her eyes pausing on their laughter, imagining the sound her own child might one day make. She stacked her woodpile higher than before, knowing warmth would soon be needed, not just for herself. At night, she whispered prayers into the dark, asking for strength, for protection, for courage, to carry a truth that could not remain hidden forever. Deep in her chest, another truth pressed upward, that the night of fire had been more than desire. It had been fate. She and the warrior were bound by something larger than circumstance, and that bond was now growing within her, preparing to meet the world. Clara Boone carried her secret through snow and silence, through whispers and worry. She bore it with the patience of a woman who had survived storms before. Yet she knew this storm was different. This one had not passed. It had only begun. Years slipped by like water winding through the bends of Willow Creek, each drop heavy with memory. Clara raised her child with steady hands and a guarded heart, weaving love into the fabric of each day, while keeping the truth of his beginning tucked away. The boy Cole grew with a brightness that made neighbors smile and whisper in equal measure. His eyes, dark and watchful, held a quiet fire that did not come from her. They belonged to the man who had stood in her doorway on the night of the storm. When Cole laughed, the sound rang through the cabin like bells. When he grew still, his gaze seemed older than his years, as though something untamed lived behind it. Clara saw it every time he looked at her. And though it filled her with wonder, it also cut with longing. She never spoke the truth aloud, not to Cole, not to Miles Turner, who lingered in her life with the patience of a man who understood waiting. Miles was kind in the ways that mattered most. He stacked firewood without being asked, left apples by her door after harvest, sat with Clara and Cole on quiet Sunday afternoons, when the silence pressed too hard. He never demanded answers, though sometimes his eyes carried questions his mouth would not shape. Clara was grateful, but gratitude was not love. Her heart had been claimed on a night torn open by storm, and no amount of gentleness, no measure of kindness could uproot it. She held her secret the way she held her child close, fierce, balanced between fear and pride. Seasons turned. Spring rushed in with meltwater. Summer followed when Cole ran barefoot through tall grass chasing dragonflies. Autumn came and Clara stitched him small jackets against the cold, smiling at how quickly he outgrew them. Then winter, when the world pressed white and heavy against the windows and Clara sat by the fire. Cole curled in her lap, telling him stories of heroes and long journeys, though never of the single night that had shaped his very existence. But far beyond Willow Creek, across open plains, memory worked its slow alchemy. Rook, the Apache warrior of the Stone Ridge. Apache carried that night like an ember that refused to die. He fought to bury it beneath duty, beneath the unending demands of his people, beneath battles etched into his skin. Yet the ember endured flaring when he least expected. When he lifted his bow, he remembered the way Clara had lifted her face to his touch. When wind crossed the ridges, it carried the scent of rain, and with it the memory of her cabin. Her fire, her lips unsteady against his first breath. In the quiet ring of distant campfires, when others slept, he stared into the flames and found her eyes staring back. They held the same mingling of fear and want he once carried. He told himself to release it, to believe it had been only one night stolen from the world. But the bond would not loosen. In the hiss of grass, in the cry of hawks, in the steady drum of his own heart he felt it. The pull of a life he could not see yet somehow knew was there. A child perhaps, a legacy born of that night. Clara, for her part, felt the echo of the same tie, though she never dared to name it aloud. Some evenings, standing at the creek's edge with Cole's small hand wrapped in hers, she gazed toward the far ridges and imagined him there, the warrior who had vanished with the dawn. She wondered if he thought of her. She wondered if he knew. Then Cole would laugh, tugging her hand, and the moment would break. Clara would smile and go on, tucking the ache back where it belonged, behind chores, behind practiced smiles, behind the steady rhythm of a life that looked ordinary to everyone but her. Time did not erase it. It only cut the lines deeper, carving them into both Clara and the warrior alike. And though distance stretched wide between them, both carried the same truth in their bones. Some ties cannot be severed, some nights cannot be forgotten, and some hearts refuse to be reasoned into letting go. The valley began to change again. Winter loosened its grip, and spring rushed in, creeks swelling fields, greening as if overnight. Clara Boone felt the season everywhere in birdsong, returning to mornings in wildflowers, breaking through thawed ground, and in the way her son Cole ran ahead of her, laughter lifting clean into the sky. Yet alongside the beauty, something restless stirred. Clara noticed it first where it did not belong, tracks pressed deep in soft earth near the forest's edge. Then feathers appeared black and sleek, snagged in fence posts and caught in branches close to her cabin. Shadows lingered too long along the ridge shapes, shifting against the horizon. Each sign tightened her chest with equal parts dread and hope. She told herself it was nothing, She told herself she was only imagining what she longed for most. But her heart knew better. One afternoon, as the creek churned with meltwater and Cole knelt to toss pebbles into the current, Clara worked in her small garden. Fingers deep in the soil, pulling weeds, setting seeds, tending the simple tasks that kept life steady. Sun warmed her shoulders, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe in peace. Then she felt it, the prickle along her skin, the sense of being watched. She straightened slowly, eyes lifting to the ridge across the creek. At first there was only sunlight on stone heat shimmering above the ground. Then the movement came measured, powerful. A horse stepped forward, hooves landing with quiet authority. On its back sat the figure she had carried in memory more faithfully than she had ever admitted. Her breath caught. He was there. Rook, the Apache warrior. The man who had disappeared with the dawn so many years before rode toward her. His hair, long and black, lifted in the breeze. Sunlight flashed against the bone necklace at his chest, against the leather bands circling his arms. His eyes, those same dark, untamed eyes that had burned themselves into her heart, were fixed on her. For a moment Clara could not move. She stood rooted like the willows along the creek, her heart hammering hard against her ribs. Not fear, rather the weight of 1,000 unspoken years settled over her. Cole looked up from the water, his small hand still wrapped around a smooth stone. He followed his mother's gaze, and when his eyes found the rider, he froze. The stone slipped from his fingers and vanished into the creek unnoticed. His mouth fell open in wonder, though he could not name it. Recognition flickered across his young face, the blood within him. Answering the blood before him, the rider guided his horse down the slope, each step measured, reverent as if the ground itself demanded respect for this moment. When he reached the bank, he dismounted, landing lightly. Every movement chosen with care. He walked forward until only a few paces remained between them. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Her heart spoke before her voice, racing with relief, longing, and fear knotted together. Then he spoke her name. Clara. One word. Low, steady, carrying the weight of years. It rolled through the valley like a bell, striking something deep inside her that had waited silent and aching for far too long. She swallowed hard, unable to answer. Tears blurred her sight, yet she would not let them fall. Cole stepped closer to her side, his small fingers clutching her skirt. He looked up at the stranger, then at his mother, sensing a truth he could not yet grasp. The warrior's gaze dropped to the boy. His eyes softened, recognition, as certain as the sun rising that morning. He knelt, lowering himself to the child's level, his face no longer set with distance, but touched with reverence. Cole studied him, curious, tilting his head the way children do when they sense a bond without a name. After a long pause, he whispered, "Who are you?" The warrior's mouth curved the faintest hint of a smile, breaking through years of silence. His voice rumbled like distant thunder, warm yet careful. "Someone who already knows you." Clara's chest ached as relief and fear collided within her. She wanted to run to gather Cole into her arms and shield him from the storm of the past that had stepped into the present. Yet another part of her, the part that had never stopped longing, wanted to close the distance, to believe fate had not abandoned them after all. The silence stretched heavy with questions not yet ready for words. Finally the warrior stood, his eyes never leaving hers. In them she saw longing raw and unhidden. She saw regret, the shadow of choices made and years lost. But most of all, she saw recognition, the same bond she had carried in secret reflected back to her. Clara's breath trembled as she finally whispered, "Why now?" His answer came slowly, each word deliberate. "Because some things cannot be left behind. Because I have felt it every day, and I cannot ignore it any longer." Cole pressed closer to his mother's side, his wide eyes moving between them. He did not understand, not fully, but something in his heart told him this man was more than a stranger. Clara held Cole close, torn between the safety of silence and the risk of truth. Yet as she met the warrior's gaze, she knew the time for hiding had passed. The years of waiting were over. What began that night in the storm had returned, carried on the wind, written into the beating hearts of all three standing by the creek. And in that taut, trembling moment, Clara understood whatever came next, her life would never again be lived in silence. The stillness along the creek finally gave way. Not to words, but to touch. The warrior reached out, and in that simple connection, years of distance fell apart. He did not hurry. He held the boy's hand as if it were something holy, as if the slightest pressure might shatter it. Clara watched, her heart caught between fear and relief. For years she had carried the truth alone. Now it stood openly before her, unhidden, unavoidable. When the warrior finally lifted his gaze, it locked with hers. There was sorrow in it, and resolve. "I should not have left," he said at last. His voice was low, steady. "Duty. My people. My blood pulled me away. I believed distance would shield you. I believed forgetting would be mercy. But forgetting never came." Clara's lips trembled. She had waited so long to hear those words, yet they tore open wounds she had sealed tight. "I thought you were gone forever," she whispered. "I cursed the night you came, then begged for it again every time I closed my eyes." He stepped closer, his hand lifting a loose strand of hair from her face, gentle in a way that erased the years between them. "I returned because the bond could not be buried. I felt it in every breath, every mile I crossed. When I heard whispers of a woman in Willow Creek, I knew it was you." Clara wanted to believe, yet fear curled beneath her ribs. This was no place for dreams, not when survival demanded caution. And soon the shadows proved her fear was earned. For weeks she had noticed signs, men's tracks pressed into mud where no neighbors should pass. The faint scent of smoke on the wind, though no campfire belonged nearby. Rumors carried by traders, men hungry for land that was not theirs. The iron spur men, her quiet labor, her careful savings, the small fortune she had hidden away. All of it had turned her cabin into more than a home. It had made it a mark. The warrior sensed it before she spoke. His instincts, sharpened by years of reading land and men, warned him. One morning after scouting the ridge, he returned with a grim set to his jaw. "They are coming," he said simply. "Not wanderers, not hunters, men who take what is not theirs." Fear rose in Clara, but she did not step back. Instead, she met his gaze with steady resolve. "Then we will be ready, together." They set to work. Rook moved with quiet precision, turning the forest itself into defense, setting snares where careless feet would fall, stacking fallen logs into barriers, marking vantage points where his bow would speak true. Clara gathered what she could, storing food, reinforcing shutters, preparing her cabin not as refuge but as stronghold. Cole, wide-eyed, helped in the small ways he could, carrying stones to the fire pit, collecting kindling. His laughter gave way to solemn focus. Through it all, Clara saw the warrior not only as a fighter, but as a guardian. His strength was fierce, yet his touch on her shoulder, on their son's hand, remained gentle. He was not only readying for battle, he was building a family's defense, claiming them as his own. That evening, as they stood together in the doorway, watching the forest darken, Clara felt fear and hope press in equal measure. The warrior's presence steadied her. His return had drawn danger close, but it had also given her something stronger than fear, the promise that she would no longer stand alone. The threat was real, the danger near, but so was the bond between them, forged in fire, tempered by years of silence, and now sealed by shared resolve. Whatever came, they would face it side by side. They came at dusk, a ragged band of settlers driven by greed, hungry for land and blind to anything but their own desire. Their laughter rode the wind, careless, cruel, certain. The lone cabin by the creek would be theirs by nightfall, or so they believed. To them, Clara Boone was nothing more than a widow with a child, easy prey on land too rich to be ignored. They did not know the warrior waiting in the shadows. The forest stood with him. The ridge, the creek, even the wind bent to his purpose. When the first intruder stepped into the clearing, an arrow cut the air and buried itself in the post beside his head, splintering the wood clean through. Curses erupted. Surprise cracked their bravado. Rook moved through the pines like lightning, silent, relentless. Every motion sharpened by years of survival. Inside the cabin, Cole pressed close to Clara's side. Fear clawed at her, but she refused to yield. She had faced too many storms alone to bow now. With shaking hands, she armed herself with what she had: a rifle, a knife, a will that would not break. When one man forced his way through the window, Clara struck with fierce resolve, driving him back into the darkness with the fury of a mother defending her child. Outside, the clash surged. Rook fought with precision, an arrow loosed here, a blade drawn there. Nothing wasted, nothing reckless. He fought not for pride, but for family. For the woman beside him, not merely a keeper of secrets, but a fighter in her own right. Shoulder to shoulder, they stood against the storm of men who had misjudged them. One by one, the intruders faltered. Greed gave way to fear. The cabin they had marked as weak became a stronghold, its defenders bound by something fiercer than any hunger for land. By nightfall, the men scattered back into the trees. Their arrogance shattered their designs, undone. Breathless, Clara stepped outside with Cole in her arms. Rook stood near the creek chest, rising hard, bow still in his grip. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Together they had faced the darkness. Together they had endured. The night that followed was the quietest Clara Boone had ever known, not the hush of fear, nor the hollow stillness of grief, but a peace with weight. The wind softened through the pines. The creek, swollen with spring rain, murmured like a lullaby. For the first time in years, the valley seemed to breathe easy, as though the land itself had witnessed the fight and chosen rest. Clara sat on the porch with Cole curled against her chest, the boy already drifting into sleep. His small breaths steadied her own innocence, unshaken by the violence that had passed. Across the clearing, Rook stood tall, his form etched in moonlight, watchful, unmoving. His presence alone, a vow unspoken and unbreakable. When dawn arrived, it painted the valley gold. The sun climbed slow, spilling light across the ridges, turning Willow Creek into a ribbon of fire. Clara stepped down to the bank, Cole rubbing sleep from his eyes. Rook joined them, silent at first, until his voice broke the hush, firm, certain. No one will take what is ours to protect. Clara's heart swelled. For years she had carried her truth alone, hiding love in silence, raising a child in the shadow of fear and hope. Now the secret no longer belonged to her alone. Now it was theirs, bonded not by whispers, but by fire, by storm, by survival. Cole reached out, slipping his small hand into the warrior's. Clara placed hers over both of theirs. The three stood together as full daylight crowned the hills, the creek rushing beside them. Its song rolled on, timeless, unbroken, bearing witness to a beginning newly claimed. In that quiet moment, Clara Boone understood a truth she would carry for the rest of her life. Love forged in fire does not shatter. In a land that gave nothing freely, they had built something enduring, something no storm, no whisper, no enemy could ever strip away. A family, a home, a legacy. The valley that once echoed with loneliness now carried laughter. Footsteps. The sound of lives no longer hidden but shared. The cabin, once a place of waiting, had become a refuge. And the warrior, once only a memory carried through years of silence, now stood beside her, his gaze steady with promise, with endurance, with readiness for whatever storm still lay ahead. As the day opened wide, Clara lifted her eyes to the horizon. The past rested behind them, its pain, its quiet, its long seasons of separation. Ahead stretched a future unwritten, but no longer faced alone. Together they would carve their place into the untamed West, their story sewn into the very soil of Willow Creek. And so their story reminds us of something enduring. Sometimes the fiercest storms do not bring ruin, but rebirth. Sometimes what begins in fire becomes the very thing that cannot be destroyed. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which moment spoke to you most. Let your words join this legacy of love and resilience. Subscribe for more frontier love stories, tales of passion, survival, and bonds too strong to be broken. Because in the wide, wild West, it wasn't only legends that were born. Families were too. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations that's inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.